excited to dive into our sheep show today, and I think a really good way to start is with these three sheep on this side of the ring. I think they bring a lot of positives just in terms of probably doing the most in terms of the skeleton standpoint, in terms of structure, and I think there's probably a few things that split them in my mind. I think out here it kind of goes 1, 2, 3 for me in terms of where they need to line up. Sheep that I like to start is going to be the young lady right here in the middle. I think that's the best one out here by quite a bit, and athletic, fresh. Really good in terms of how he works himself in motion, like his heaviness of structure in this class. He's easily the one that's just the most genuine in his shape and spread, still combines it with the right kind of skeleton. Going to follow up with the young lady's sheep in second, and I think the reason we do so is even though that one's not as stout as our class winner, we study 2 and 3, and that's the one that's just more comfortable in the way they handle their top line, the way that they're constructed out of their hip and hind leg. Really like the design of that one's rib cage over the one in third. Like from the ideal, probably not, like I said, just as hard touching and as hard shaped as what we find in our class winner, but a really high quality sheep in its own right. Young man's sheep right here is going to be third, and I think from his flank forward, I can find some good in that one. Probably just a little more shapely up high than our second place sheep. I like the fact that he's tall at the point of his shoulder and good chested. I think for me it has everything to do with from his flank back. He wants to round out of his hip. Is a little too uncoordinated in the way he gets out and goes. And I think of the top 3, he's the most immature in his rib cage. Need to pry him open through the center portion of his body cavity to really change how that one looks from just a maturity and overall substance standpoint. Young lady right here has got a ewe lamb that I think, compared to the one directly behind her, has just got more extension, more grow, and is more comfortable in motion. Is that one as stout as the one to her right? Absolutely not. But I like the fact that that one is still conventional in her growth and just flexibility. Like I said, a sheep that's got some reach and go. Don't know if there's enough of her to get her into the top 3. That's why we leave her in 4. Really stout one in 5th. I think we talk about muscle shape and dimension. That one's got as much as any. Really heavy structured and really powerful. I think the reason I probably harp on that one and get it down quite a bit is because that one's skeleton is just comes way too unhinged in motion. Front end assembly just isn't good enough. We study that one's spine in motion. That one's weak behind its shoulder, up in its spine, and just too uncoordinated. Easily the earliest maturing sheep out here. Want to see that one with more grow and more comfort in terms of its build. Ewe lamb that comes next is one that probably blends things together a little better from the side, just in terms of how that one's collected in its spine, a little more attractive in the assembly of its hind leg. I guess for me, my first impression is that one's awfully plain up front. Don't think that one's just as sporty in its look. Study that one in the ground, and of the ones that sort up, that one's the frailest in its foot and bone work. Blue sheep comes next, and I think a sheep that's got some quality from the side is useful in the way that it gets out and goes. I just wish there was more of her. You get up high with these sheep, and she probably is the most peaked in the way her rack and loin is laid into her from behind. I just don't know if her upper hip and stifle shit's big enough to move higher. Whether that comes out next is one that I think honestly probably is just a little more opened up right out of the back of his shoulder, a little bigger hip and stifle laid into him. For me though, that one in relation at the ground, I think his foot size is a little frail. Study the point of his shoulder, the way his neck hooks up, and I don't know if he balances as well. And then the sheep that rounds out the class is one that's really good bodied. I like that one's reach and go off either ends. In this class in particular, we study shape up high. That one just reads a little too plain for me, with a little more length of blade, probably the roundest in terms of its hip design. Really nice way to start. If you guys are on the stand, let's give these kids a big round of applause.
those lambs gauge better because he's gotten all of a sudden they just didn't hit.
Because the last time we were
get into our second class in the sheep show, and you know, we think back to that first class and maybe not one that just jumps out as quick and grabs your attention as hard. But I think when you start kind of piecing these things together and trying to think what makes the most sense to start, I think there's one sheep that just from a fresh shape and muscularity standpoint kind of fits the bill for me today. You know, is this sheep perfect in the assembly of his shoulder and chest? Absolutely not. But I still think that's one that's got some look and presence. Sheep I like to start as the young man in the middle. I think that's the one that's just got the most good in this class. I think we've got two ewe lambs that are share some similarities just in terms of their build. I think what it comes down to is one is probably just a little more open in terms of the rib cage, probably just a little stouter all the way through. Sheep I like to be second to young lady up front. I think that's one that's got some value from a build and skeleton standpoint. Easily the better chested one in this class, especially compared to our class winner, who probably blends her shoulder a little better. I just wish in relation to our winner there was more of her, because from behind she wants to funnel at the upper part of her hip. Kind of leaves you with the same impression from behind. Sheep right here is third, and I think one that from you study how their joint works laid into them. I think that's a sheep that's definitely got some reach and go, and I like the construction of her hind leg. I think of the top three, though, that's the one that I'm quick to label as immature and green. I don't know if that one's there at this stage of the game. We study how that one's pieced together from the side. I think one that's probably got a little bit more curve in terms of her shoulder. I'd like to shorten up her vertebrae and make her a little square out of her hip, but I still think you fix those things, that's a sheep that's got some quality. Sheep right here, the young man's, is one that honestly probably is a little bigger right behind his shoulder in terms of his rack shape than our third place sheep. I think one that is square out of his hip, a little more attractive in his hind leg. I think for me, there's a couple areas that I want to fix him in order to get him into that top three. We start studying his back shape, and even though his rack is good, I wish his loin edge matched, because it fades quite a bit, probably not as square and upstanding as what we find on the sheep on this side of the ring. Another one that from behind needs to be stoutened up to the base of his stifle, and I think of the top four is probably the most plain and ordinary in terms of his look up front. Ewe lamb that comes out next is one that, you know, does a lot of things correctly from the side. That's a sheep that's got some presence, got some reach and go, and I think is right at the ground. In this class in particular, there's just not enough of her from behind. You study her hip shape, how she's built out of the back of her shoulder. We just need more sheep there in order for her to drive up. Really powerful sheep comes out next, and I think if you're just going to run with muscle, that's one you could sort up higher, because that one is easily one of the biggest backed and biggest hipped ones in class. What matters more to me is their skeletons, and if you study this guy from the side, he just kind of comes in way too many pieces in motion, gets off behind his shoulder, up in his spine, and a little round off both ends of his build when put in motion. Want to stretch that guy out and give him a little more maturity from a size standpoint. Sheep that comes next, long, extended, more comfortable in the way his skeleton is laid into him. In this class in particular, he's probably the frailest at the ground, doesn't open up with enough shape right directly behind his shoulder blade, leaves me with the same impression from behind. And then the sheep right here is one that from the outside I thought would go up a little higher because he's definitely wide skeleton, probably a little stouter in terms of his bone work. When I get my hands on him, he's just a little plain and ordinary in his shape. Don't know if he's just as firm and crisp to the touch. Probably reads a little coarser down through the base of his chest and his shoulder. Really nice second class of the day. Let's congratulate these kids once again on a job well done. Get a little more in line with me. That's the two sheep we've got up front. I think they're probably just a little more in line with what I like, and I do think there's some subtle differences that split that pair. The one that I'm going to end up starting is actually the young lady up front, and I'm going to start by saying I'm not a fan of that one's shoulder blade at all. That one's got way too much point to his shoulder. That's why I sit there and wait so long to pull the trigger, because that's a pet peeve of mine. And honestly, I don't like using long-shouldered ones, but sometimes you just have to go with what's in front of you. And when you actually get that one presented from the side, everywhere else, I think he's the best. The fact that he's as tall at the point of his shoulder as he is, he's easily the trimmest in his neck. I think the big advantage for this sheep over the one that's going to be second is how you study their length and levelness of hip. I think he is square from that standpoint and more attractive in the assembly of his hind leg. Really hard-touching sheep that's big hip. Now, we talked about his shoulder blade. The other area that makes it close is he is probably the most juvenile and immature in his rib cage. He looks like a skinny sheep, and I'm okay with that. But I think this look from the side is what you got to go into. I think that's the one that brings forth the most good for me today. Blue sheep's going to be second, and I like that sheep a lot. That's the decision for me is between those two because of the pair. That is the one that's genuinely rounder in the shape of his body. Even though his shoulder blade is still long and probably has a little too much point, I actually think he probably controls his shoulder a little better in motion. I like the way he's built in terms of his top line. Some things that I want to modify about that one is how he's built out of his hip and hind leg. I think of the top three, he probably drops the most in his pin set, wants to get his hind leg up underneath him ever so slightly. And I think you study their chest to flank relation, and the deepest part of him probably ends up being his chest for today. I want to change the way that if I can even talk, I want to change the way that transitions back out of his chest into his flank. I think that's a pair of them that are awfully high quality. I think you can debate on which way you want to go. I think there's just more interesting pieces in the sheep up front. The sheep in third is probably one that from the stands you find a lot of good in because that thing's got some big legs, love his body shape, and I think one that is proportional in terms of his skeleton. For me, someone that preaches look and build, I just want to stretch that guy out. He is the moderate one in here that just reads a little too compact. And I think of the top three, not only is he the shortest in terms of his neck attachment, but I also think he's the shortest in terms of his hip. Sheep that's definitely big back, probably not as hard touching as 1 and 2, but I think a sheep that's definitely got some spread and dimension. Like I said, that is an interesting trio of sheep for sure. You guys have made me think pretty early on in this show, and that's fun for me because it gets the brain going and makes me lose a few more hairs. So, like I said, really nice set of sheep. We're going to bring those 3 back later on at the end of the day. The sheep that comes out next, the young ladies, I tell you, muscle shape is definitely not lacking, and I like that one's back shape. I like his stifle shape, and I think there's a lot of good pieces in that one. Your problem is you run into kind of a buzzsaw of the class and end up having one that probably just isn't as out there from a look and skeleton standpoint. He probably is a little round in the way he's put together. Probably just isn't as attractive in the way he does it from this side. Young lady's sheep that comes next probably has the exact opposite problem. I like his look, I like his build, and I think his hind leg's attractive. Just ain't enough of him of those top 5. He probably is the narrowest right out of the back of his shoulder, probably fades the most down through the base of his stifle. Young ladies, you that comes next is one that's really, really long and extended up front. I like her top line and hind leg. Once again, not to preach the same message, just got to be more of her. From behind, we got to drop her down in the seat of her pants, give her a little more substance for her to ever make a play up high. And I think of the sheep that soared up with her, she's probably the frailest at the ground. Sheep right here, I think one that could have benefited from a little more time on feed because there's some parts and pieces of that sheep are good. The design of his hip and hind leg is correct. I think his top line is laid into him really well. Gets out and goes with some reach off by the rim. We study the way he's built up front, and his front end assembly is probably not attractive enough for me. I think in this class in particular, maybe even compared to the 2 that are behind him, he may be the narrowest in class, but I like his skeleton. That's why we keep him up. This sheep right here is bigger backed, bigger hipped, and a little stouter. I think at the same time, though, with those extras in terms of muscularity, it also kind of falls off from a skeleton standpoint. He does, his front end assembly is just a little too coarse and plain for me. I think you study his hip. He's probably a little high in his pin set, wants to round out of his dock and not be maybe just as good in terms of how square he sets him down from behind. And then the gentleman's ewe that comes next is a good profiling sheep that does a lot of things right from the side. I think another one that just could have benefited from a little more time because you get your hands on that one. She's awfully green and immature in her shape. Even though there's some muscle there, we just got to get it up in her and have it a little more upstanding for me. She probably fades the most to her edges. Really interesting class. Very, very interesting top 3. If you guys will, let's put our hands together on a job well done. I think these 4 sheep are good, and a little difference just in the way that they're put together. And obviously I made them walk several times, and that's because I want to study how everything blends together. And obviously you got to take into consideration a little bit of muscle differences. Like I said, I think you could easily justify, honestly, using any of these things, depending on, like I said, where your priorities lay. I think the one that, to me, is probably just the most fault-free in this class, one of the better skeleton ones that's probably as good as any in motion. I think you add that with the fact that he's got a big back, and he's really opened up out of the back of his shoulder. Probably the most attractive in the way he uses his hind leg in this class in particular. The sheep that I like to start is actually the young lady right here in the pink shirt. I just think there's some pieces about that one that are just really unique, and I say that while knowing that we probably need to clean him up right at the top of his hip and how he transitions out. But that may actually be his saving grace, because he actually gets out and uses his hind leg with as much reach and attractiveness as any. I think that sheep puts a lot of good together. I think from there, this is where it's tricky, because you've got 2 sheep that in my mind are really hard touching and have a lot of just raw shape and power. And then you've got one that's a little more interesting in terms of how they get out and go. Like I said, I think structure for me is the one hardest thing to get right in these sheep. The one that I'm going to use for second is actually the gentleman up front. And I do that while knowing that of the top 4, he may be the softest to the touch, honestly. He's not good enough right behind his shoulder and from behind. But I think what matters more to me is when we put those 3 sheep that are in contention for second in motion, he's just got that much more reach off either end of his skeleton. That's still one that's got some spread and shape, even though we need to chisel him up just in the way he lays it on. From there, we're going to follow up with the young lady back here. I think that sheep's awfully intriguing in terms of his back shape. He's got a ditch running down his back. I love the fact that he's tall-fronted, good-chested. For me, though, there's 2 areas that I want to modify him. Number 1, of those top 3 sheep, he is the rawest and probably the most immature in his rib cage, the flattest in his forerib. And then I think we put those top 3 in motion, and that's where his hip and hind leg just become, a little bit of an issue. He wants to get up underneath himself, maybe push his hock out ever so slightly. But I think that's a good sheep that if his body and shape was a little rounder, you could easily justify running with that one. Today, I'll call him hard in terms of his forerib and need to modify his hip and hind leg. Kind of the smoky colored sheep's going to be 4. And I think from his, honestly, his shoulder back, I think there's a lot of good in that one. Another one that's hard touching, and the young lady's absolutely got that one stuck. Does a really good job of presenting him, and I like him on the standstill. When we start watching him in motion, that's where I can get a little more critical of him, because I think it ends up hurting him on both ends. He wants to drop his sternum and his shoulder blade in motion, and if you study his chest to flank relation, I think it runs the wrong way. From behind, we watch how he powers off his back leg. And when you've got one that's got that much hard shape, it's no surprise he wants to push his hock out in motion, probably get a little goofy in the way he sets his hind leg down. I think all 4 of those things are very intriguing. That's why all 4 of them got a blue ribbon and are going to come back. I think they do a lot of things right. Like I said, you can go a lot of different ways. For me, look, build, and quality of structure is what I try to stick to. Really interesting set up top. Ewan that comes out next. I like this sheep a lot. I do. And I want you to know that in this class, she's the soft one of the top 5. That's the best way to put it. She doesn't handle good enough out of the back of her shoulder. I think that one's probably pushing the most down over her ribs. When you get your hands on top of her, she's just too modest in her shape. Love her look, love her build, and love what she does from the side. She easily, though, of the top 5 is probably the biggest question mark from a composition standpoint. That lady right here has got a thickie for sure, and I like the power, I like the substance, and I like just his genuine spread and dimension. For me, though, I think of the ones that get up, we can quickly call him the early maturing one that's just small. We got to lengthen that one out off both ends. Study his chest and how it relates to his front end. He probably reads the coarsest, probably the deepest to the floor of his chest. I want to lengthen out his hip to move him up higher. Whether that comes out next is probably one that, just from a handling quality standpoint, has got some good. I like to turn to his stifle, really good upper hip. For me, though, we study that one in motion, and he's one that gets a little out there in terms of his hock placement, wants to roll his back wheels, probably isn't stable enough in the way that he uses his shoulder blade and knee in motion, probably reads a little thicker through the base of his neck. Blue sheep comes out next. Really, really, really good bodied sheep that actually spans pretty wide and I think has some width of skeleton. At the same token, I also think that's one that gets a little plain in terms of his design and build, just a little round off both ends of his skeleton. Elam that comes next probably fixes his issues from the side. Is attractive, is good balanced and sound. In this class in particular, she runs into a dog fight. There's just not enough of her right now. Got to power that one up to get her any higher. And then the weather that comes out next is definitely a terminally oriented sheep that's got some shape and some grow. I think in this class in particular, he's probably the frailest in his design, probably the most immature in terms of the way he spans out of the back of his shoulder and down through his hip. Really interesting class, top to bottom. Let's congratulate these kids once again on a job well done. Finally get fired back up on the sheep side of things, and I'm glad we waited because that one's good, real good. I know it took us about an hour to get him in here, but man, I'm glad I waited because that one's pretty freaky. Good looking, good hind leg, great body, fresh, still looks the part from the side. Use that one to win and don't think twice. You got a decision to make right here for second, and I do think it's relatively close. I think there's some subtle differences between the pair. just in terms of what I see and kind of how these things kind of line up. The young man sheep's going to be second, and I think for me, when you study these sheep up high and from behind, and how their rib cages are laid into them and how they progress out of the back of their shoulder, I think there's probably just a little more sheep there today. I like his extra length to hip, and from behind, that's easily the bigger hip one that's got a stouter hind leg. He's more secure in his ankle. Still think he paints an awfully good image from the side. I think the sheep follows the same mold realistically in terms of his build. Probably just runs out of power and substance just a little bit in terms of his rib and up high. I think of the top three, he's the plainest to the base of his stifle. I'd like to lengthen out his hip quite a bit to make his hind leg work even better. The sheep that comes out in 4 is definitely stout. There's no denying that. I think that's an ultra big back, burly one that's packed full of muscle. Same time, for someone that preaches look and build, I don't think you can go all in on him from the side. He's too coarse up front, thick at the point of his neck, and just in motion, when you study how he goes, he's just a little round off either end. Don't think he balances up with the same elite quality we maybe find in those 3 sheep that sort up. When it comes out next, I think fixes his problems in motion. He's better in terms of his top line balance. I like how his hind leg gets out and hits the ground. I think that sheep does a lot of things correct. And honestly, for what's in here, his upper rib cage is probably as good as any of them. The way his forerib transitions out of the back of his shoulder into the middle portion of his cage, I think is really good. Where I probably harp on him just a little bit in relation to those top 4 is, you study him up front, and I think how his chest is laid into him and his shoulder blade, I think it just makes him a little plain from the side. He's the shorter hipped one in this lineup that for me, we handle up high. Probably wants to round over his loin edge, maybe gets a little plainer in the shape of his stifle. Whether that comes out next is one that initially I thought from the side did some things really good from his shoulder back. I think he hooks up right in motion and does the right kind of hip and hind leg posture that I like. For me, it's up front. That guy's neck attachment's not good enough up high. Wants to get a little plain in terms of the length of his blade and chest. And honestly, in this class, there's not enough of him to merit any higher. This sheep right here is probably a little bigger backed, probably better in terms of his loin and how it transitions into his upper hip. I think that's a sheep that's got some look. In the grand scheme of things, though, even though I like his shape, I still think that's one that could have benefited from a little more time because he just needs to pull apart. We study how he moves in motion. He wants to open up at the top part of his shoulder blade. Don't think his neck hooks up quite right. A sheep that's got some good that honestly just needed a little more time to really man up. This sheep right here is another one that I'm going to mention a lot of the same things about because I think that's a good sheep that realistically winds up in the wrong class and out here kind of just gets out-horsed and out-powered because you study his back shape. I don't know if it's just there yet, to be honest. We got to drop his spine down into his rack and loin, make it a little more upstanding and give him a shot more booty for it to work. But I think that's a sheep that skeleton is right. I like his length of stride and how he works his shoulder blade. In this class, though, his shape's just too immature, a bit too juvenile for me to keep running with him any higher. Sheep that rounds out the class is one that, from a structure standpoint, is definitely good in terms of how he hits the dirt. I think that's one that's comfortable. From the side, though, that's where I harp the most on him. He's probably the roundest in his build in this class, just a little too plain for my liking. I think a sheep that's got value, definitely from a grow and extension standpoint and structure. I just think from the side, he probably falls out for me. Really nice set, though. Really, really good one to win. Let's congratulate these kids on the job well done. Another really nice set of sheep, and I think this one probably shakes out just a little quicker in my mind, just in terms of kind of where you need to go. Sheep in the back wins and does so pretty quick. That one is special. I think there's two sheep on this side of the ring that are better structured, but when you can pack that much on him in terms of just raw shape and power, it makes the most sense, and he still combines it with a good look from the side. Like I said, I think that sheep wins pretty easy. Young lady right here, second. I'll be honest with you, I know you've had a hard time getting that one set up, but I actually think his best look is in motion. I like that sheep on the go. Really good in how his shoulder and knee works and his hip and hind leg. Like his top line balance and rib cage for sure. I think that's a sheep that definitely has muscle, and I'd never say he doesn't. Is it as much as our class winner? Probably not. He probably just gives up a little bit in terms of substance and power, especially when you step in behind him. I don't know if he's good enough down through the base of his stifle to really rival that sheep that wins. Sheep down here on the side looks really nice. I love how tall he is at the point of his shoulder. Really good back sheep that's got a right kind of sculpt to his hind leg and looks athletic when the young lady's in front of him. When we put him in motion, though, we start noticing we got a little more chest than we probably need to. His chest to flank relation is off a little bit. And I think of the top three, that's the one that you study four-rib and just muscle up high. He probably reads the most immature for me. Probably need to just power him up to really rival the sheep that go 1-2. Sheep right here is intriguing, especially for a spec. I like that thing. And if we think about dropping him in a spec division, that's one that can run. Good body shape. I think a sheep that at this stage of the game still balances well. I think he does a lot of things right from a feet and leg standpoint. We get him in this class and a little bit of that spec side of him starts showing because he ends up becoming the soft one, and just his high quality, his tone and texture is probably not there with what we find in 1-3. I like that sheep. We trim him up and get his back up in him. I think that's a sheep that can hang with these pretty quick. Sheep right here looks really nice on the standstill. That young lady's done a nice job of getting his head and neck up out of the top of his shoulder blade. I think one that's got some back shape, some turn to his stifle, and has got some power from behind. It's when we put him in motion that I start getting a little more critical. He wants to get a little awkward with his spine, and we study him even right here, and when we put him on the go, he wants to roll his hocks quite a bit in motion, need to clean up his shoulder blade. And I think if we could make him looser, like we just mentioned on his spec, that's one that could go up a couple of spots and be in the hunt. Sheep right here is really opened up out of the back of his shoulder, really good upper hip and drops some turn down low. I think that's a sheep that's good in the center portion of his rib cage. For me, though, I think when we start thinking about this class in particular, he's the one that probably hits me a little quicker. He's just a little plain in his look. I don't rate him as attractive in terms of his shoulder and chest. Probably wants to round his hip ever so slightly in motion. You that comes out next is another one that's up in terms of her back. Really good pin width. I think that's one that's got some hip shape. For me, we study her shape up high and what's at the ground, and I just think I wish it matched because she is a little frailer in terms of her bone work. I think we study how her neck sets on the top of her shoulder, the construction of her shoulder blade. I just don't think it blends together as well as maybe some sheep ahead. Sheep right here is one that from a terminal standpoint, you can find a lot of merit in because he's got a big square back in him. I really love just how powerful that one is out of his hip, good rib cage. For me, though, that is another one that we study him at the ground. He's probably the frailest in this class in terms of his foot and bone work, his foot size. Another one that just reads a little coarse, a little round off either end of his skeleton. And then we got a ewe right here that I think balances well, does a lot of good things in motion. In this class in particular, I just don't know if there's enough of her to move her up. Got to power her up, give her a little more genuine spread and shape to sort any higher. I think an awfully good set, though, if you guys will. Let's put our hands together for these kids on an excellent job. I like both of these sheep awfully a lot, and I think they're both very high quality. I think both of them are right in their skeleton. I think both of them are attractive. I think when you've got a pair this similar, I think the thing that ends up splitting them is honestly just a little freshness and shape. And when you get your hands on him, I think that sheep up front is probably just a little manly in terms of his back shape, how his loins laid in him, and the shape to his stifle. I think that's the one that's probably got the most genuine shape and spread, still does it on the right kind of skeleton. I love the sheep in second. I genuinely do. I think that one is freaky from the side. I think that is one that represents some look, some balance, and his hip and hind leg posture is way good. I think the biggest thing that we need to do with that one is realistically, if I could have seen him in a week or two, it'd have been a different ballgame, because I think his back would have came up in tune just a little more. His hip would probably be even bigger, and I could run with his skeleton, because I do think it's awfully intriguing. That's a really good pair of sheep that soared up to go 1-2. I commend both of you young ladies on getting these things put together, because they're awfully unique. One that comes out in third is another sheep that I like a good deal. Really square up high, really big hip, heavy structure. Probably isn't as freaky as those two sheep in terms of his shoulder assembly and how his neck ties into the top of his blade. But I think that's one that's got some good. Need to lengthen his hip out. Like I said, probably just doesn't represent some elite looking presence we find in 1 and 2. Blue sheep, if you want to talk about muscle, that's the one you latch onto, because that thing's hard touching, good back, really powerful from behind. I think we talk about power sheep a lot and how sometimes it can hurt their build a little bit. I think you watch that guy get out and go. We've got to modify the way his spine's laid into him. And even though that's a sheep that's actually good in his shoulder assembly, he is pushing a little through his chest. I think the other thing is his hip is just a little short. I think if we can lengthen that out, it would allow him to get out and reach, probably with a little more reach and flexibility off his rear skeleton. Sheep that comes out next is one that I love his length of his skeleton and how his hip and hind leg work. I think a sheep that represents some balance and some symmetry from this side. In this lineup in particular, just not enough of him. He's very raw in his body shape up high. I think he probably fades the most over his rack and loin edge of those top 5. We just need more of him to run. Blue sheep that come next is actually stouter, and there's no denying that. Really good in terms of his rib cage and power. awfully plain though from the side for me. He's just a little coarse, very round in terms of how his hind leg works. I wish he balanced up with more look and quality. Ewe Lamb that comes next is probably a little more attractive one. That's a little square in terms of her build. I think of the sheep ahead, though. We study her upper pin set and how her back's laid into her. I don't think she's stout enough today to go any higher. Just got to give that one a little more ump in order to move her up in terms of just raw power and substance. And then the Ewe Lamb that rounds out the class, I think actually paints a good image from the side. I like her look and balance. We study her from a muscularity standpoint, and I just don't know if there's enough there. We also study how her hind leg works. She wants to roll her hog, twist her toes in, got to square her up in the way she comes and goes. Really nice set, though. Let's congratulate these kids once again. Got two sheep over here that I think are awfully nice and do a lot of things correctly. Young lady's sheep back here wins, though, pretty easy in my mind. And you've got a cheering crowd. That's what's fun. No, that's a good-looking dude that balances well. I like his hind leg posture. I think he does a lot of things correctly just from a shape standpoint. His big advantage over the ones that go second has everything to do with his look from the side. He's better in the assembly of his shoulder. He's square out of his hip and more attractive in his hind leg posture. I think that's a sheep that's got a lot of good and a lot of quality. Sheep that comes next mimics a lot of the same shape and rib cage we find in our class winner. I like his heaviness of structure. Another one that for me we talked about why he gets beat. I think you study his shoulder. He reads just a little coarse, a little round out of his hip, and I don't know if he's as stout back there either. Really good sheep. Both of those are awfully high quality. Congratulations to those two. Young lady right here's got a darker fibered sheep that's really muscular, really stout and powerful. I think for me, though, from the side, his look and balance just isn't up to par with those two sheep that sort up. Reed's a little open in his shoulder blade, a little round in terms of how his hind leg works. Need to square him up out of his hip. Sheep right here is leveler, and from that standpoint, probably a little square in terms of his hind leg posture. One that, in my opinion, just kind of runs out of substance from behind. Got to stout him up through the base of his hip, get up front, wants to open up at the top of his shoulder blade. I don't know if his neck hooks up quite as well either. Sheep right here is very powerful, very stout, really big hip, opened up. We study how that one gets out and goes and his look from the side, and I just think it's a little uncoordinated, a little plain in terms of his design. Need to clean him up from the profile to really drive up any higher. Sheep that comes next is one that I think in this class in particular kind of hits me, even at these heavier weights, is still just being a little young and green in his shape. We got to get his back up in him, get his hip to drop, but I think more importantly than that, we study his front skeleton and the way his neck ties on to the point of his shoulders, just a little too low for me. Need to clean up his shoulder blade. And then the sheep that rounds out the class is one that's back's actually a little bigger. I like the fact but he's square up high, probably works a bigger upper hip. Need to drop him down through the base of his stifle, stouten him up at the ground. More importantly than that, just give him a little more look for my life. Really nice set, though. Let's put our hands together once again for these kids on a great job. I think we get our lightweight sheep out here, and I think the one that makes the most sense today is the young lady's sheep. I just see a little more growth, a little more presence, and get in behind those sheep, and I think that's one that feeds a great deal of muscle shape at this stage of the game. That one's not perfect from the side. We need to clean up how that one's hip and hind leg works, but I still think that's the highest quality one that's out here. Little blue sheep goes second, and I think one that's really good to be that young in terms of her rib. Really big back, really stout hip. Just a little compact for me in terms of her build. Need to square her up off either end. If you guys will, let's put our hands together and congratulate these two on an excellent job. And I think these sheep are ultra high quality. We start thinking about a top 5, and I think there's a couple of them that kind of hit me hard initially, and I think do a lot of things really, really well. In terms of the one I like best, I think this one is very high quality, and I think represents a lot of good, a lot of hard pieces to put together with his kind of shape and muscle. And then once we start sorting down, I think things get just a little closer. I'll get off the mic, I'll set it down and show you the 5 I like. One more time, let's show these kids some love. Really, really good set of sheep, top to bottom. know we've only got one class of ewes out here, but I think these 5 represent a lot of good and a lot of quality. And I think they come in a lot of different parts and pieces, so you've got to think about where you want to land and what you want to run with. And I'll say that somewhat open-ended because there's one to me that is just kind of unique. I love her look, I love her skeleton, beautiful hind leg assembly, gorgeous rib cage. Her flank line, top line balance is in line with what we're trying to do at home. Even though she just knocked the young lady over, I think that's a dang good one. That's the one that we're going to use to be our champion. Congratulations to that young lady. That makes so much sense. I think from there you've got some sort because there's probably 2 of them that fit me pretty good. And I think there's things we would modify about them structurally. Just to free them up just a little bit. The 2 I'm talking about are on either end. I think both of those are very unique breeding pieces. I think they can do a lot of good. You know, the one that's probably just a little more out there for me in some parts and pieces, her neck set, just how hard touching she is. It is very, very impressive. One I like second best is the blue sheep in the back. I think that's and like I said, she's not perfect. She's a little timid in terms of how she sets her rear leg down. But that one's muscle shape is hard to deny. Gentleman right here is going to have our 3rd overall. And I love that one from the side. And how she works the top line and hind leg. Probably a little sounder than the one we just talked about. She's probably pushing a little more down into her shoulder blade. Probably isn't just as freaky up front as those 2 sheep we just saw, but that's still a good sheep in her own right. Our 4th overall use going to be the young lady right here. I think that one is so powerful right here. It's so powerful and good body, really stout and dimensional and opened up. I think compared to those first 3, probably isn't just as ladylike up front, probably isn't as sporty in her build. But I think from her shoulder back, that's what she's truly impressive. And I really like the blue sheep that comes out next, and I'm going to take a minute to talk to her because I think she deserves that. I think that's one that's probably a little thinner in terms of her neck compared to the one that we just discussed. I like the way she's built right behind her shoulder, really squared back. For me, I want to modify her hip and how it's built. She's probably a little long in terms of her vertebrae, which throws her off just a little bit from a balance standpoint. Another one that even though she's thinner neck, probably does have a little shoulder. I think her underlying balance probably isn't just as attractive and isn't as sweeping as what we find in some of these others. And like I said, I know we talk a top 4, but I wanted to mention that one because I think that's a high quality sheep. Honestly, probably the deepest set we've seen in one class thus far. I think that speaks volumes for what you guys are doing here. Not a whole lot of those 5 that's pretty well. We'll go ahead and talk the rest of them. Young ladies, you right here. Good body. I think one on the shoulder back has some things I really like. Really opened up on the top side of her skeleton and big hip. For me, though, compared to those top 5, she just wants to open up too much at the point of her shoulder. Gets a little opened up in motion, probably isn't as feminine up front. Ewan right here is really square up high. Got a good shape in terms of her upper pin width and stifle. I think for me, though, one is just kind of jammed up in terms of her build. Needs to be a little longer in terms of her hip wing. Probably gets a little thicker at the base of her neck. Blue sheep right here is really tall and feminine. I think that's one that's extended from the side and sound. In this particular class, she just hits me as kind of frail. Probably not enough to her to go up any higher, but I like what she does in terms of her build. And then this unit right here, I think it does a lot of things. Just from a body shape standpoint, I think that's one that's got some spread. For me, though, from the side, she just kind of comes in too many pieces, especially in motion. Got to set her neck up higher on the top of her shoulder blade, make her a little square, and then her hip behind leg works. Once again, awfully good set of females, if you guys will. Show these kids some love one more time as they're up the